Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome for this session. We'll talk about the transformation of international relationships, international trade, under the auspices of Donald Trump, who's tending to use this as a diplomatic weapon. So besides the power of a single man, what can we say about tomorrow's exchanges? Is will protectionism be the new standard? Free trade, does that belong to the past? And chiefly, what is these new politics strengthen the United States? Did they strengthen the United States? This is what we'll see. And to talk about this with me, we have Christian Saint-Étienne, economist, member of the Circle of the Cercle des Économistes. Next to him is Valerio Demoli, Director General of the European House in Brussels. He's a recognized expert of international trade. And then we have Miguel Otero, senior researcher at the Elcano Royal Institute, professor and director of research. And next to him we have Juan Carlos Vicapineda, a former Minister of Foreign Trade in Mexico. And you are also a teacher, a professor, and consultant. And next to you have A.D. Crebo-Rediker. You're the senior fellow counsel, which is an American think tank. And next to me, Cyrus Vance. You're an associate at Baker McKenzie, and have a reputation in complex issues, international disputes. You were prosecutor in the District of Manhattan, Cyrus Vance, but you have no relationship with the J.D. Vance, nor as a member of your family or politically, and you are recognized in certain cases like the DSK trial and the Epstein affair. So, Christian, you'll set the scene. You'll talk about the objectives or the goals of the tariffs. So, well, the question is Trump. Does he control international trade relations? That is the topic. When Donald Trump announced his new tariffs, he himself set three goals for his policy. He said that his trade policies and tariffs would enable to reindustrialize the U.S. The second objective, he wanted to get $416 billion on international trade to finance drops of taxes, lower taxes in the U.S. And incidentally, I will go over a few decisions of the Supreme Court which led to the fact that the U.S. did not collect $460 billion. But nevertheless, Trump lowered taxes for the middle class in the U.S. The third goal was to make the U.S. a dominant imperial power. And the question is, first, did Donald Trump meet his objectives? He wanted to sit the power of the United States, but I can't not say that the U.S. are the leading world power. It's been the case for 50 years, and he managed to convince the American people that you had to remake the U.S. First power in the world. It's been the case for 50 years. It's extraordinary how you can manipulate people, including the most powerful country in the world. But he wanted to prove to the U.S. that he would re-give the U.S. its leading role. And on the three objectives he had, well, with the tariffs, there's no reindustrialization in the U.S., few evolutions, but no real reindustrialization, especially in the manufacturing industry as part of the GDP. And I reminded you of some decisions of the Supreme Court which invalidated in February 26 the tariffs that have been applied on the basis of the EIP, International Emergency Economic Powers of 2017. So Trump used other American laws to try to reapply these tariffs, but for the moment the revenues are not at the level he had announced, and this is what we'll be talking more extendedly. Trump is not remaking the U.S. the first power in the world, but he gave some strong incentives to the other countries in the world to speed up trade between them around the United States. And I'd say the key reason for Trump's mistake, if you take the different measures of the weight of the U.S. Of the world GDP, it's about, 3%. China is around 20%, 30% for the U.S., 20% for China, if I got this right, I'm sorry. The GDP in buying power markets, 23% for the U.S., 20% for China. Fortunately, Europe, which was at 25%, dropped down to 17, 18%. But if the U.S. represents 23% of the world GDP, in the world trade, the U.S. represents only 11.5%. So he totally made a big mistake. So the trade is happening around the U.S. He wanted the U.S. to dominate international trade, but he built a kind of defense wall, and the trade is taking place around the United States, outside the United States. So our friends will be talking about the impact of Donald Trump's decisions on international trade relations. Thank you, Christian, for setting the scene. Round of applause. So, Mario Demoli, do you agree with this first taking stock of Christian? So what is the impact of these new measures taken by Donald Trump? So maybe we could start on talk about the U.S. and then the impact on Europe. So thank you very much, Isabelle, and I will develop on the topic starting with a chronology, dates.
That is easier, and also for the rest of the panel. I lead the largest Italian-based think tank, number 4 in Europe, with 350 people and more than 500 strategic studies every year. And one of the many studies that we have done is an observatory to study what the impacts of the Trumponomics are in the different economies in the United States and in Europe in particular. Please raise your hand who believes that the impact on the United States of the Trumponomics is positive. Nobody.
No answer.
I'm not sure if that is because nobody understands English or because nobody agrees. So I take it for not. But let me go to the facts. I don't want to lose too much time with jokes. I have identified 10 problems, 10 impacts that are very negative to the United States. First of all, the trade deficit and tariff burden resulted with a record historical high trade deficit, $1.3 trillion, never high as much. And the initial narrative was, I'm going to raise the tariff because I want to reduce the trade imbalances. So mission failed. The income of the federal government was $264 billion in 2025, record high. But then the Supreme Court obliged Mr. Trump to give it back, most of it. And all Italian exporters are extremely happy because, as a matter of fact, consumers in the United States and importers, they paid the bill. And so now the Italian manufacturers and European manufacturers and exporters are taking money back. So it's bingo. Currency depreciation, it never happened in one only year that the dollar devaluated double digit, minus 14% in 2025. Household savings are at the historical minimum since Lehman crisis 2008, only 4.5%. Poverty lines, record high, never reached 44 million people, with another million people at risk of poverty in a very famous Yale research just published. Inflation, 4.2. And the assumption at the very beginning of the Trumponomics was we are going to reduce inflation. So again, it's at the highest level. Social instability. The United Nations has ranked as many as 20,000 social protests across the United States, more than double than the year before. The approval rating of the president is at the minimum, as you all know. I don't read numbers. The loss of the future. This is probably the worst statistics of all. The non-American students asking for participation in the American university system is at the minimum level, double-digit the growth. Again, is what we called a loss of future. Researchers, foreign researchers in the United States, 2/3 of them are asking and looking for other opportunities, namely in Europe. And then lastly, the European capitals invested in the United States are 1/3 of all investments in the US, and they are going to withdraw. Let me tell you now very rapidly the 8 positive impacts on Europe.
Donc on voit finalement beaucoup d'impacts négatifs.
We see a lot of negative impact for the U.S., inflation, research, poverty, but for Europe it's more positive. That's what you're going to tell us, right? Yes, it's very positive.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trump. He rang the bell of the wake-up call to Europe. That's our point. If you look at the, in general, of the export and the manufacturing activities, it's at the record high in many countries, in Italy in particular. We reached 637 billion of exports just in Italy. But the wake-up call has allowed in few weeks to conclude international trade agreement with other areas. Let's take the Mercosur example with the 4 countries. After 25 years of continuous negotiation and discussion, in few weeks, the agreement was signed. We still need to be ratified by the parliaments of the different member states, but that is an incredible achievement. The same with India. After 9 years of continuous discussion, the same with Indonesia, the same with China and Australia, and I can go on. And that will liberate incredible trade opportunities for all manufacturers in the years to come. Eurobond and private savings, we did Eurobond agreement only at the peak of the COVID period. Now we are about to start again to introduce and enlarge the Eurobond activities, which is another positive point. The foreign non-European students asking for universities in Europe at the record high. So we are getting whoever else is not going to the United States, double-digit growth. Defense and energy transition, again, positive investments and budgets. European pride, after all. And I can continue, but I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to stop it. But on voit effectivement, merci. On voit votre enthousiasme et effectivement donc les côtés négatifs.
See your enthusiasm and the negative aspects for the U.S. and the positive impact for Europe. So this is comforting in a way. Miguel Otero, do you agree with this position? And what are for you the scenarios for the future that could be envisaged? Good afternoon, everybody. It's hot in here, isn't it? It's even for a Spanish person. No, I'll shift to English because it's easier for me, if I may.
Let's try to understand why Trump is here, right? Because Trump is a symptom more than an accident, right? And I think a lot of the structural reasons why Trump...
Can you speak?
Yes.
Yes.
So a lot of the structural reasons why Trump is here, I think were laid out by Valerio, that are before Trump, and Trump made them perhaps worse. But one key issue in international trade is that the United States has tried to change China, right? I mean, I think we have to understand that China operates under a different economic system. I'm not going to bother you too much with macroeconomics, but you know, in the Fleming-Mundell trilemma of you can only have 2 out of 3 things in macroeconomics, which is you can only have free capital flows, an independent monetary policy, but to have that, you have to have a floating exchange rate. China operates under a different regime. Basically, China still operates today like we operated in the Bretton Woods regime, which is capital controls, a relatively intervened exchange rate, and independent monetary policy. So we have the United States and Europe working under one regime in macroeconomics and China under a different regime. And the United States has over the past 30 years tried to change China's policies. And they have not achieved it. China still operates under its own regime. And Trump has tried to throw everything the United States had to China, first with the trade war, then with the tech war, with Biden severe export controls. And China is still growing, still the major challenge to the United States power. And in many ways, although Trump might have been a federalist for the Europeans, and perhaps some numbers are positive for Europe, it's true that while the United States deficit has not shrunk, as Trump wanted, it's true that for Chinese businesses, it's much more difficult to export to the United States, and a lot of these exports are coming to Europe, right? And this is what we call in economics now the China shock 2.0, that is affecting Europe severely, especially Germany, because a lot of the competition is in products where Germany was dominant. And I think we have to discuss, and our how to deal with that, right? And whether protectionism is the solution or not, right? And Merz, latest after these talks on China, Merz view that, you know, we need some sort of Plaza Accord. For those that know China, the history of China, this is the worst you can say to the Chinese, right? If you say to the Chinese, well, we need to have some sort of new Plaza Accord like in 1985, you know, where we will kind of make sure that your currency appreciates under pressure, they will not do that, right? And so I think the solution cannot be protectionism. We can maybe use protectionism to gain time, but we need to know what we protect. And especially if you want to protect what you have, you need as well to invest in the technologies of the next 10, 20 years. Protectionism alone, I told this all the time to my American friends, will not work. So you might gain time, but what you need to do is to invest heavily, back to Draghi, etc., to the Draghi report, invest heavily in Europe, have an industrial policy in Europe worth that name so that you can be competitive in the technologies of the next 10 or 20 years.
Alors après les points de vue, donc France, Espagne,
Then the French, Spanish and Italian points of view. We have on Quantum Color Baker. We're getting closer to the United States. How do countries like Mexico see this reorganization of international trade relations?
Very happy to be here today and to offer the views and my perspective of what is happening in Mexico. As you may know, Mexico is the largest trading partner of the United States. That means that Mexico is the country that buys the most and the country that sells the most to the United States. So in that sense, my country, Mexico, really is always on the first line of the impact that the policy decisions that the United States takes are reflected. Now, in that sense, I would agree that certainly President Trump's trade policy have not achieved what he claimed that they were going to achieve, but that doesn't mean that disruption is non-existent. The fact that those policies or those tariffs or those decisions to control or not control certain sectors may exist, that already causes a chilling effect, I would argue, in the decisions of companies to invest and to produce more and to basically plan ahead for the future. And that's where I see that the most controversial decisions by President Trump have actually had an effect, in which the companies and the organizations, we as individuals, we just don't know what to expect. Now, how has Mexico, despite the fact that in the short term, I also think that Trump has been beneficial for Mexico, because if you looked at the numbers, I won't bother you with the details, but if you looked at the numbers, Mexico has actually strengthened its position vis-a-vis trade in the United States. We are trading around $900 billion. That is a massive amount of trade. Just to put it on perspective, $900 billion a year, it's about twice the size of the economy of Argentina. Argentina's economy should be around $550 billion. So roughly, Mexico trades with the United States twice the size of the economy of Argentina. And Argentina is a G20 economy, okay? So despite the fact that in the short term, those policies have not achieved for Donald Trump what he attempted, the uncertainty continues. And the way that Mexico has coped with that uncertainty is basically by trying to diversify our trade. That is why the President of the Commission, the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and Antonio Costa, who was here this morning, they traveled to Mexico about a month ago to sign a new trade agreement between Mexico and the European Union. Mexico has also tried to expand its commercial network with countries in Asia, Japan, Australia, and others, but by no means is that going to deliver results in the short term. All of this, and I go back to the points that my colleagues were making, all of this, what should be making us think is not if we adapt to what is happening right now, but what are we going to do after that? And that is, I guess, the open question.
Heidi, on va continuer avec vous, Heidi Crébo-Rediker. De votre point de vue, de votre think tank américain, comment vous vivez justement tout ce qu'a fait l'administration Trump?
How do you see everything that the Trump administration has done?
That have been made, but I also think it's naive to think that the trade bucket stands alone, because the way that the Trump administration has viewed its leverage from trade, and yes, Trump is tariff man, he campaigned as tariff man, nobody should have been surprised about it. When he's negotiated with our closest allies and really escalated on the trade front, he's put national security, coercive investment agendas for investment into the United States. And that's a mix of hard and soft power. So trade, yes, I think that this has been enormously damaging on many fronts to the United States, because we've torn up every agreement that we've ever signed, including just yesterday, the Trump administration negotiated the updated NAFTA agreement with Canada and Mexico, and just 2 days ago on July 1st said that they were not going to move forward with the renewal. So I think what was surprising in the United States was the attack immediately against allies and the putting of national security and defense on the same negotiating platform alongside trade, because you have an economic coercive part of this negotiation that stretches into the military as well. I will say that while the Supreme Court has pushed back on the IEPA, the International Economic Emergencies Powers Act authority, there will be other legally justified and congressionally supported replacements to many of those tariffs. But I think that is keeping your eye on that one ball without missing the big picture. We have a drive where we've seen, before Trump came into office, of an acceleration of a China +1 strategy and now a US +1 strategy. It covers economics, commerce, now defense. Yes, there are benefits that Europe is seeing if it takes the opportunity, because I don't actually see a fragmented capital markets at the same time as a fragmented defense industrial base being a positive thing for Europe right now. And I've been a strong proponent of a consolidated bond issuance by the European Union for many years, but it's so incremental, it's not going to get you there unless you are much bolder. In terms of what we see moving forward. I think that we are moving into a world of choke points. So it's not trade and tariffs, it's really economic choke points. It's Hormuz, it's China's pushback with rare earths. That is the ultimate choke point that actually broke the trade negotiations with and the escalation of tariffs against China. And that choke point, point of perspective is really far more important in the US-China competition. And Europe has no real leverage when it comes to choke points right now. And the world is really thinking about choke points. Europe is thinking about kill switches. We just pulled the kill switch on Anthropic's mythos and fable. That's a very big moment for Europe to consider, that we put export controls really on the future of the defining space in the international economy and security on the big AI frontier models. So I think we need to be thinking a lot broader about choke points and kill switches, and it's not just the US. If you think China is a benign, innocent actor in this, you are profoundly naive. I'll leave it there.
Cyrus Vance, bien que vous ne soyez pas vous-même un expert donc, du commerce à proprement parler,
But in France, although you're not an expert yourself in certain areas, you are point of view from point of international trade. You have experience in dispute resolution from our point of view as a lawyer. Are there predictions you can make concerning the Trump trade policy? Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here.
As has been introduced, but I do have an unusual experience to bring perspective, I think, this afternoon. I know Donald Trump for many years in New York City, where we both have worked, but also I was the prosecutor who investigated the Trump organization, and ultimately that organization was indicted for tax fraud, but only after we had gone to the United States Supreme Court over 2 years twice. So I think I have a perspective on Trump's view of trade as it's best understood, in my view, his trade policies, not as economic doctrine, but a negotiating method that he applies in everything that he does, and the same one that was observable in his litigation all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the problem that the president has there is that strategy ultimately runs into the same hard wall in trade as it has in court on other unilateral issues like tariffs, other Supreme Court reversals, and not only the court, but the institutions that he deals with, the counterparties, ultimately learn how to deal with Trump better. And so his negotiating strategy, I think, becomes less successful over time, but it has always been the same. Go for the maximum, push, 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 don't give in, and then change tactics when it occurs. Now, if you ask me whether Trump's trade policies are...
Oui, est-ce que finalement, voilà, ces politiques de Trump, elles affaiblissent ou au contraire, est-ce qu'elles renforcent?
Is it strengthening the position of the United States or not? Do you think his policy is strengthening the United States or is it weakening the United States?
Different clocks. For Trump, it extracts real short-term concessions that he can point to and does point to every day. But what it does that is dangerous, it converts structural power into episodic power. And by that I mean the one-off deal and the threat. Structural power in the United States compounds power. Episodic power, which are these various negotiations, it depreciates power. I'd say free trade is not dead, but the US is spending its endowment. And to use a prosecutor's analogy, you can win every motion in the trade war, but you can still lose the jury and lose the trial in the end. So my view on American trade, I think, is positive. My view on the future is positive. And I think we just need to know and understand and look at some of the very simple history of the man who is now the President of the United States to understand what the future trade policies will be.
Et justement, alors, ce que disent ces politiques sur l'État?
What do these policies say about the rule of law in the United States? What do these policies actually say about the rule of law in the United States?
who are citizens and lawyers look at this with great concern. And certainly the Supreme Court has not rejected all of Trump's arguments. But Trump's term is going to presumably be over in 2 years. As a lame duck president, he will not have the same authority over Congress to pursue the economic policies that he wants. They don't want to go into their next election carrying Trump's baggage. They want to go into their next election carrying their own ideas and perhaps the ideas of the new party leader for the Republicans. So I think that from the legal perspective, America, I still believe, is secure, it is sound, I'm optimistic. I believe the Supreme Court, whether they're conservative or not, is an institution that will survive.
Christian Saint-Étienne, alors après ce premier...
After this first round table, Christian, how can we sum up everybody's positions? We can see that finally Europe isn't doing too badly, in fact.
Plutôt bien sur le plan technique.
Yeah, it's doing pretty well technically speaking, and it manages to improve its strategic position in world trade. Nevertheless, it doesn't solve the structural problems of our continent. Insofar as, unfortunately, we did not join the computer revolution. There are no European GAFAMs. We used to produce a good percentage of microprocessor in the year 2000. We're at 8% now. There was an attempt 18 months ago by a European commissioner to increase the share of Europe in the production of microprocessor up to 12%. A few months ago, the same European commissioner abandoned this objective, saying that it will be at 8.59. And so this is what was mentioned in other sessions of this Les Rencontres. The capital in Europe is massive, the savings in Europe are massive, but we don't manage to invest in industrial production and new technologies. And what's interesting, nevertheless, is that if we relate that to trade by going more in depth in the commercial trade with Mercosur, India, Japan, if we increase that, it provides a new surface to Europe faced with the US. We will almost forget that we're the first commercial power of the world, trade power, way over the US, behind in GDP, but ahead in trade. Nevertheless, there is a trace of what happened last July in Turnberry in Scotland, is that Europe just lied down and accepted what Trump imposed on us on trade. And it was a strategic mistake because Trump was obsessed by the trade deficit on goods deficit, but the U.S. have an enormous, are way ahead in services, and in 2025 the deficit on the whole of the exchange of goods and services of Europe versus the U.S. is only 20 billion on over 1.7 billion. But Europe hasn't managed to introduce in the negotiations with the U.S. services. So we accepted what Trump imposed on us on goods with the 150 billion deficit to the detriment of the U.S. So we didn't manage to integrate services in the negotiations. And to conclude, well, the rest of the world saw that we had just abandoned. We just surrendered, quote unquote, in a previous roundtable. The acceptance of Europe of what Trump imposed on it is incredible. The Chinese saw that, the Russians saw that, the Brazilians saw that, and it makes it much more difficult for Europe to negotiate with China, because the Chinese say, well, you lie down in front of the U.S., we'll force you to lie down in front of us. So it's a real big question for the months to come. So do you agree with what Christian just told us? Maybe we can start with our European speakers. I don't know if Miguel, you wanted to react on what Christian just told us on the fact that can Europe today, does Europe have the means to pull out of this mess? Well,
I think what is the most important public good? And the most important public good is security. And in security, we are still largely dependent on the United States. And as Donald Tusk, former Prime Minister of Poland, put it, I mean, it's almost inconceivable that 450 million Europeans need to ask for help to 320 million Americans to face 160 million Russians that are not able to beat 40 million Ukrainians, right? I mean, so I think that leads us to investment, and that leads us to Eurobonds, right? I mean, this would be actually an amazing moment to issue Eurobonds. I mean, if the European Commission, the European Council together would tomorrow, or tomorrow is Saturday, but on Monday, say, we will issue Eurobonds for the next 5 years, the equivalent of 15% of GDP of the European Union. 3% every year for the next 5 years. On defense, on industry, on technology, on research and development, on European public goods, right? According to Draghi, we need roughly 5% of GDP. So 3% would be public, and I'm sure then if you do that, the private sector would put another 2% or even more on this big project. So and the moment is vital, because right now a lot of investors, they want to move away from the dollar, right? They would love to put their money in Eurobonds, right? But unfortunately, we are not there yet. But at some point, perhaps the Russian threat or the other threats or climate change or whatever will push us to do what is needed, which is big investments in European public goods.
Valerio Di Moli, bravo, oui, on peut... Valerio Di Moli, vous êtes d'accord?
Valerio Di Moli, do you agree? Do you have other suggestions to make for the future? Other ideas?
Eurobond space, we have more than 10 trillion cash deposited within families and corporates across Europe. We have $13 trillion assets belonging to European corporates invested and families invested in United States assets. I'm not saying we need to withdraw all of it, but if you just put 2% taxes on that, they may withdraw a lot of it and make sure that they can invest in defense, in space, in relevant strategic industries across Europe. In healthcare, we need to be proud of our healthcare systems across all of Europe, Italy, France, Germany, all of Europe, Spain. So we have all of the resources needed in order to face the critical situations we live in.
Juan Carlos Becker-Pineda, comment est-ce que vous voyez?
Juan Carlos Becker-Pineda, how do you see the international economic evolution? What are the future paths? We're not going to go back to the past, that's for sure, but how can you imagine the future new forms of trade negotiations?
Thank you. I don't believe that we are going to go back to the past in every sense of the economic world, that is. We are not going to have the same system that lasted for 80 years in terms of, small inflation, predictable environment, governments not trying to control trade or the economic activity in general. I think that we are going to see a future economic system in which, unfortunately, several of the concepts that President Trump has inserted in the public debate, whether that is national security, economic security, or similar concepts, are going to be replicated by other countries to the extent that they can. Some countries with very large markets, resources, and population, I don't know, I'm thinking about China, I'm thinking about Brazil, I'm thinking about India probably, are going to try to replicate those same policies in their own domestic way. I don't really know if Europe is going to follow on that same path. For other countries, smaller, medium countries, Mexico, Canada, Australia, even Argentina or Costa Rica, well, we will have to see how we insert in those new conditions. I believe that the world is also going to be more protectionist for at least a few years before we try to devise a new system. However, whatever system we might end up having, I think it will be an outcome of how the US and China try to resolve their differences. Because as much as Europe or Latin America or other countries of Asia would like to weigh into that debate and try to sort of tone down certain policies, I think that at the end of the day, at least for trade and economics, in the short term, whatever system will come out of it is going to be the result of how China and the US understand each other, or they don't understand each other.
Et il dit pour vous, on ne reviendra pas, et dit Crébo-Rediker, on ne reviendra pas non plus.
We're not going to go back to the past, even if Trump leaves, even if there's a change in policies there. Do you have the feeling that the United States were weakened by these policies, Trump policies?
I think that when trust is broken, it's one of the hardest things to repair, and then there's been a lot of damage done in trust with our closest allies. So I do think it's going to be hard to go back. We have another 2 years where you will have trade flowing like water into different trade agreements, different reconfigurations of the trading system. You will still see a rise in weaponization of dependency, and that does come very much from both from China and now very much so from the Trump administration. But you also are going to see some extremely significant shocks coming out of the China 2.0 shock, and it's not going to be just the US and China. It's hitting the EU already very significantly in the auto industry, in a lot of the overcapacity that's being exported right now, but it's also China's exporting capacity is going up and down the value chain from very, very low input goods that are hitting Indonesia, Vietnam, to very high-tech goods that they really are across the value chain, and that's part of their model. So that will be something that it's not just the U.S. and China; it's every country that engages in the global economy. I don't think we're going back, but I do think that there is going to be another world on the other side of this administration. I do think that the U.S. is going to still have a very strong, compelling economic story to tell. The dollar will still be the reserve currency that's dominant in the world. The only real challenge would come from Europe, from consolidated debt issuance. I spent 20 years as a banker in European sovereign debt capital markets before I went to Washington. I've been talking about consolidated Eurobond issuance for a very long time. And I talked to individual countries about it. And while conceptually Draghi and Letta have been writing about this for years, I see so much pushback from certain countries. The only time we've seen it is during COVID and just fund Ukraine. So I do hope that it goes in that direction, but call me a bit of a skeptic right now because I've seen it too close and too much. The critical mineral challenge is one that once China launched its export controls on rare earths and rare earths magnets, it was not just against the United States. They did this in 2010 against Japan for a geopolitical pushback on this in the East China Sea. When they announced those export controls, it was against the world. And so any advanced industrial country and companies that are within that advanced industrial economy are going to be subject to needing to cooperate, whether or not you have a multilateral tendency from Trump or not. There's just no choice. So I do see that there will be individual areas where we will be cooperating whatever the Trump administration thinks about multilateralism, and I do see a path forward at the end.
Il nous reste une dizaine de minutes avant de passer à vos
10 minutes before we move to your question. Cyrus Vance, I'm sorry. How do you see the future? Are the U.S. weakened, and how do you how do you see the rebuilding of commercial trade and negotiations for the future?
Now, and so I think it is easy to look at the United States and superficially say this is a country that has lost its, its majority. It's not sure where it's going. So I think there is ample reason for people to look at the United States and predict negative things. Fair enough. But the United States has been through world wars. It's been through a civil war. It itself has been challenged many, many times more seriously in its history than what it's facing today. So as an American, and I think every country has something like that to look back on, I think there is an enormous amount of resilience and power and common sense in America pertaining to Trump. You cannot negotiate. You cannot diminish your position. If you do, he'll take that inch and he won't give it back to you anywhere else. That's certainly not as a trade analyst, but as someone who has a sense of how he exerts power. The power you have, you need to exert as well.
Alors, est-ce que vous avez des questions à poser à nos experts?
Have any questions to ask our experts? Yes, we gentlemen here, 2 people. Can you bring a microphone? If you could introduce yourselves, please. Thank you very much. It's very kind.
As you want.
Okay, because my question was for Vince. So my name is Alex, Alex Sileux. I'm working for a French company called Eiffage. So my question was, after the Trump administration hopefully terminated, how do you think that the trust for French company in the US will be increased?
Thank you for that question. And, it's such an important question. America tomorrow celebrates its 250th anniversary. And at the same time, we celebrate, everyone in this room, a special relationship between Europe and the United States that for the last 80 years has been our primary alliance. I think we have to live through the period that we're going to live through. Open-eyed, it's not going to be easy. But I do think we need, both in the Democratic Party and I think as Republicans grow past Trump and gain the strength to not act like Trump, we are setting the stage for, I believe, a longer period of rational collegiality, but foremost, respect. And I think one thing we've really lost in America in its messaging today is giving respect to the world community in which we are existing.
Je crois qu'on avait une autre question. J'avais vu.
I think we had another question. The gentleman had his arm up there. Hello everybody, my name is Gérard Blanc. I'm a professor at the Faculty of Law and Political Science in Aix-Marseille. I'm the local guy. Since yesterday, I've heard lots of people talking about the power of Europe, the European enthusiasm. It's true that Europe exists on the economic level and on the commercial level. But the question I have, I'm asking myself that question because I realize the obstacles that face Europe. Professor Saint-Etienne talked earlier about what happened in Scotland last year when Europe laid down in front of the United States, in front of Mr. Trump. I'm wondering whether politically Europe actually exists when we see what's happening in the European Parliament, at the Council of Europe, the difficulties that constantly arise, the blockages that constantly occur, the time it takes to take any decision. I'm not surprised that Europe politically has huge difficulties in existing, which would explain, I think, a lot of the problems that Europe has. Christian Saint-Etienne, perhaps? In fact, it's a question that forces us to go back in history a little bit. It's something that we don't often talk about. We mentioned it indirectly this morning. Europe was created by France. And when you forget that, you make a huge mistake. In 1950, when just 5 years after a terrible war during which the Nazis inflicted atrocities on the whole of Europe, France held out its hand to Germany. We said the European countries united themselves. No, it was France that held out its hand to Germany to try to overcome the consequences of war. So Europe was created thanks to France. I don't want to talk for too long, but for as long as France was influential in Europe, starting from 1950, France through the period, the 30 glorious years, we had growth, and we had General de Gaulle. When France was seen as powerful, it played and led what you could call a European policy in Europe. France wasn't the leading European power, it was Germany. But Germany allowed the France to speak, to put things simply, and when France and Germany agreed on changes, it was acceptable to others. It wasn't that France and Germany were dominating the others, but one, a French idea, because it was often French idea, and once it had been put through the German mill, there was no reason for the Italians and Spanish to disagree. The problem was that with the increasing deindustrialization over the last 25 years and allowing our public finances to drift, leadership in Europe has now then moved over to Germany over the last 15 years. And France today is difficult to say, but France is very weak in the political, economic and strategic level, despite the wonderful speeches given by Emmanuel Macron. Germany is now the leader in Europe. The switch from France to Germany wouldn't have caused a major problem if Germany had itself conducted a European policy in Europe. The problem is that Germany is conducting a German policy in Europe and even a merchandising policy in Europe. It's been working a great deal with China because Germany was selling cars and machine tools to China, and so it's blocking all of the changes that should have taken place in European policy. In the United States under Biden, our American friends might say something about that, but Biden kept his head down during the presidency. I think his presidency, when it's reevaluated in the future, in the year 2022, Biden had the IRA and put through a very important act for the manufacture of semiconductors in the United States. He might have been senile, but he put in place a very powerful and advantageous economic policy for the United States, and he applied 100% tariffs to semiconductors in China. And he said, okay, we'll have a climate change policy, but the photovoltaic panels have to be American, the wind turbines have to be American, and the electric vehicles have to be American. We have put in place regulations so that today we have our thematic transition with Chinese electric vehicles, Chinese photovoltaic panels, and Chinese wind turbines. So the question in relation to the remark you were making is that Germany is conducting a commercial policy in Europe. France is too weak to oppose it. And when von der Leyen went to Scotland to negotiate with Trump, she had an order from Germany to find an agreement because Germany wanted to continue importing its vehicles to the United States. So the central problem is Germany, over the last 18 months, is seeing its position weakened in China now. Germany had a trade surplus with China. Now it has a trade deficit with China. So the question is, when, after conducting a commercial policy towards China, when is the German policy going to conduct a European policy within China? Maybe our colleagues here would have something to say about that. Unfortunately, we don't have any time left. I have 20 seconds left. Christian, if you'd like to give us an extremely quick conclusion. All I'd like to say is that unlike his great speeches, what Trump has done has not served the United States at all. It was the world guarantor of world order built in 1945. Trump convinced himself that this world order was too costly for the United States, whereas this world order gave great power to the dollar and to the strategic position of America in the world. And all of the panelists have shown very clearly that Trump's decisions have weakened the United States rather than making it stronger. The big question is what happens after Trump? And to conclude, our panelists have basically said that we will never go back to what happened before Trump, but we are in uncharted waters. We don't know what the rules of the future will be, and for Europe to stop getting slapped in the face strategically by the United States last year and by China now, Europe is going to have to start getting down to work, and above all, France has to start sorting out its industrial and public finance problems if we want to have the capacity to take real action on a European level. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation, and thank you for your...